Hey y'all! It's entry number 79 of this off-season series where we discuss a different player's fantasy value each day as a group. We are another day closer to the start of the 2022 NFL season. Each day we'll drop a name, go through some positives and some concerns of their fantasy profile, and then I'll give my personal opinion at the end. Today's discussion will be on Chase Claypool, wide receiver, Pittsburgh Steelers. We'll start with the positives with Chase Claypool's fantasy profile. Third-year wide receiver. Chase Claypool is still a pretty young wide receiver, as he is just 24 years old and entering his third year going into the 2022 NFL season. According to an article by Pro Football Focus, wide receiver breakout performances are more abundant from a percentage and raw numbers perspective in years 2 and years 3. So Claypool still has a great shot to break out this year. The next thing I really like about Chase Claypool's fantasy profile is that he has showcased potential in the past. Back in 2020, Claypool had a very strong rookie season that, from a fantasy perspective, was pretty much on par with CeeDee Lamb's rookie year. During the 2020 season, Claypool finished as the WR14 in standard with 152.9 total fantasy points and 9.6 fantasy points per game. The WR19 in half PPR formats with 183.9 total fantasy points and 11.5 fantasy points per game, and the WR23 in full PPR formats with 214.9 total fantasy points and 13.4 fantasy points per game according to Fantasy Pros. And in half PPR formats during the 2020 season, Claypool had 4 out of 16 games with 0 to 5 fantasy points, 4 out of 16 games with 5 to 10 fantasy points, 3 out of 16 games with 10 to 15 fantasy points, 4 out of 16 games with 15 to 20 fantasy points, and 1 out of 16 games with over 35 fantasy points according to fantasy data. The third thing I like about Chase Claypool's fantasy profile is his air yards. In 2021, Chase Claypool averaged 75.7 air yards per game, 1.45 air yards per snap, and had 26.4% of his team's air yards, all of which were above average for a wide receiver according to RotoWire. In 2020, Chase Claypool averaged 2.08 air yards per snap, 84.6 air yards per game, and had 31.2% of his team's air yards according to RotoWire, all of which were well above average, and he also had 921 unrealized air yards according to Player Profiler in 2020. Moving on to some of the concerns with Chase Claypool's fantasy profile. Competition for targets. Chase Claypool doesn't have an easy path to targets this year, even with Juju Smith-Schuster gone. The Steelers still have a WR1 in Deontay Johnson, still have tight end Pat Freiermuth, and Najee Harris, who will get some targets as well. And they drafted George Pickens in the second round of the 2022 NFL Draft, who is looking like a stud in training camp thus far, and by all indications, could be a late-round fantasy gem. With all of these weapons, there's some questions on how big Claypool's workload will be in 2022. The next concern I have with Chase Claypool's fantasy profile is that he's got a new quarterback. The Pittsburgh Steelers will have a new starting quarterback in the 2022 season, after longtime franchise quarterback Ben Roethlisberger retired. In all likelihood, that starter will either be former second overall pick in the 2017 NFL Draft, Mitchell Trubisky, or the Steelers' first round pick in the 2022 NFL Draft, Kenny Pickett. While Big Ben was a little washed last year, there are legit questions on what kind of chemistry the new quarterback will have with Claypool and how it will impact his fantasy value. The last major concern I have with Chase Claypool's fantasy profile is a possible decline in teams' passing attempts. During the 2021 season, the Pittsburgh Steelers threw the ball 664 times, or 39.06 per game, the fourth most in the NFL according to StatMuse. With Big Ben out of the picture now, Matt Canada could shift further towards the offense that we saw him run in his 175 games at the college level, which was a little more run-focused. If this happens, it would result in less volume for all of the Steelers' wide receivers to work from on a game-to-game basis. Some additional thoughts on Chase Claypool's fantasy profile. During the 2021 season, Claypool finished as the WR36 in standard, with 107.6 total fantasy points and 7.2 fantasy points per game, the WR37 and half PPR formats with 137.1 total fantasy points and 9.1 fantasy points per game, and the WR37 in full PPR formats with 166.6 total fantasy points and 11.1 fantasy points per game according to Fantasy Pros. In half PPR formats, during the 2021 season, Chase Claypool had 3 out of 15 games with 0 to 5 fantasy points, 7 out of 15 games with 5 to 10 fantasy points, 3 out of 15 games with 10 to 15 fantasy points, 1 out of 15 games with 15 to 20 fantasy points, and 1 out of 15 games with over 20 fantasy points according to fantasy data. Red zone usage. Chase Claypool saw 20 red zone targets in 2020, the most on the Steelers, and 13 red zone targets in 2021, the fourth most on the Steelers according to NFL Savant. Chase Claypool is a bigger wide receiver, standing at 6'4" and weighing 238 pounds. This past offseason, Chase Claypool called himself a top 3 wide receiver in the NFL. Personal opinion, Chase Claypool is currently going off the board as WR46 about pick 121 overall on ESPN and WR46 about pick 126 overall on Yahoo. If he played on a different team where he had a better quarterback and less target competition, I would be more intrigued with him. But we have to evaluate him on his current situation, and it doesn't seem promising for him breaking out in 2022. He seems appropriately valued right now at his current ADP, and from a fantasy perspective, almost feels like an elite wide receiver handcuff in case Deontay Johnson or one of the Steelers' other primary pass-catching weapons misses time. For each of these entries, we will highlight a charitable cause or organization. Chase Claypool and his mother created the Chasing Hope Foundation, which provides fundraising for youth suicide awareness, prevention, and intervention programs. Here's a link to that organization below. And that's it for today's entry. If you enjoyed this entry, be sure to like and subscribe.